Hello, my name is Lipa. So Twice has released their newest mini album, More and More, and it's very cheerful and bright at the same time as the world is not so cheery and bright. I don't think I have anything more clever to say than the next person. Me and my sister just donated to NACP. There's another A in there. NAACP or NACP. Okay, I highly doubt it's actually NACP. And I wasn't able to donate nearly as much as I would like to, but I will continue to do as best as I can. And if you have the possibility to, I think you should too, until we see the difference that is needed, until we see justice. So moving on to the video. So I was really excited about this new comeback, especially with the aesthetics and the dresses, particularly the ones that were in the most teasers. And then yesterday the music video came out, and I'm very sad to see that the dress I decided to make was only in the music video for about 1 second. But yeah, I really thought all of those dresses where they were in the gardens were really pretty, but just looking around the house, I didn't really have any fabrics with any exciting prints. What I did have though, and probably will always have, and I think most households will have, or hotels. I'm not recommending you steal one from an hotel, I'm just saying. So yeah, I dug up an old white bedsheet, and which dress is white like a bedsheet? Well, at least 3 of them. But the one that appealed to me most and I really fell in love with was Chaeyoung's flowy with really giant puffy sleeves, which is always nice. So yeah, I tried to recreate Chaeyoung's dress. Well, I tried, it worked out. So yeah, let's get into this video. Thank goodness it was terrible, like able to tear, not terrible, bad. So I just tore the entire way around the sheet to get the elastic out that I used for the sleeves. I also had to seam rip some fabric off the elastic. Because the white fabric was see-through, I cut out 2 layers of each piece of the dress. Apart from the sleeves, where it didn't matter because showing off some arm skin is not considered very scandalous in this day and age. So starting off with the top part of the dress, I cut out 4 rectangles, 2 inner layers along the width of the fabric. The back pieces were just a bit wider and quite a bit longer than how a perfectly fitting top would be. I cut out all pieces a bit wider because I didn't know how much seam allowance I would need for hemming the top and sewing the bottom together with the top of the skirt. I also made the 2 back pieces longer because I found no pictures of how Chaeyoung's dress looked in the back, so I decided it would look really pretty if I made a stretchy back, which means I decided to shirr the back. If you don't know what shirring is, you will see later on. Then to fit it more to a human body and not just specifically SpongeBob, I held the side seam of my top to the side seam of the tight tank top I was wearing and traced this seam onto my fabric. Then I made some different lines and cut the one I liked the best on a fold so that both sides would be the same. I also started weirdly shaping the top of the front and back, but ignore this as I had to change these again to make them look as I had initially intended. I also sewed these down, but ignore this. Then by wrapping it around myself until it perfectly fit, I marked. Then using a measure tape, I measured how long the extra fabric was. This information was vital for shirring. Then I did a little bit of math. So to shirr, you use an elastic bottom thread, regular top thread, and then the stretchy bottom thread gathers the fabric as you sew. So it can make a piece of fabric a lot smaller, but it can always be stretched out, which makes it a great and cute looking solution to how to enter into a snugly fitted dress. Now when you shirr, miraculously a fabric is almost always halved in length or width. I tested this out on a scrap piece first and it was scary accurate. So that means when you are doing your calculations, you need to shirr a piece of fabric that is double the length of how much you need to take something in to make a perfect fit. I needed to take mine in 30 centimeters, so I needed a back piece that was 60 centimeters. The back piece I had cut out was longer than 60 centimeters and I could have just shirred the whole thing anyways, then made it smaller when sewing it together to the front piece, but instead I just cut out 60 centimeters in the back and it worked out as well. Then in order to make my shirring as straight and neat looking as possible, I drew out lines. I made the space between them 1 centimeter. Tip for this is to absolutely not draw on it with a water resolvable pen while it is still wet after ironed flat. I'm sorry my lines were a total mess, but I do it no other way. So again, together we need to use an elastic bottom thread, which you need to wind yourself. It's best if you do this by hand because you don't want the elastic thread to be stretched at all while winding. Just wind it neatly, but don't stretch it. Then you thread your top thread as usual and also bring up the bottom thread as you might usually do. You might need to adjust your thread tension as well, and this differs for every machine. You determine this by sewing on a scrap piece first and flipping it over to the wrong side of the fabric after you've shirred. Make sure that was a dad joke, I'm sorry. It is neatly gathered and has a good stretch to it. So then I shirred, back stitching as normal at the beginning. By the end of each line, I lifted the presser foot and flipped the fabric so that I could sew down to the next line without having to end and begin a new stitch. By the end of the very last line, I backstitched again as per usual.
Oh, should I have socks?
Then I had a beautiful stretchy back piece. So then I pinned the two sides of the back piece back onto the now shirred piece. I sewed them inside the turns by the sides to hide them, you know, because they're not very attractive. Now back to fixing the neckline and back. This day I found another tight-fitted tank top, and when stretched out in a certain way it looked similar to Chaeyoung's. So I put the front onto it while wearing it and traced this neckline. Once it was off, I traced it again better and added about 1 centimeter seam allowance. So this is our favorite side. I folded it on my favorite side to make them close to identical. So I folded it over twice on what was to be the inside and sewed, because it was see-through and I didn't want it to fray on the inside where you could see it. Then I ironed it nice and flat, making sure you could only see the outer layer at the top. It was here I realized the back should not go up by the sides, like have straps kind of. It should have just been straight, so I cut those tops off and sewed it close. Then I pinned the front and back piece tighter right sides together. However, I had to take both in quite a bit because I had made them too big to begin with. Then I sewed one of the sides closed and cut the excess fabric off. Now moving on to the skirt, I cut out 2 large rectangles for 2 sleeves following the width of the fabric. Then the rectangle piece left I used to make a gathered skirt. So I just ripped it down the middle, once to make the 2 different layers, then once again in order to have 2 side seams. I didn't cut it to the length of the skirt I actually wanted yet, I decided to do it later. So first I sewed down 1 side seam. Then I sewed 2 straight stitches about 1.5 centimeters apart with the longest stitch length along the entire top of the 2 rectangles. Then to gather it, I lightly tugged on the 2 top threads and scrunched everything up. So after gathering the whole thing lightly, I put the top onto it and gathered and arranged the gathers to fit the top. So then I pinned the top and the skirt together, right sides together. I put the very bottom of the top on top of the second straight stitch that I used to gather, so that it would not be visible on the right side of the dress. The back of the skirt needed to be as long as the back of the top, completely stretched out. Now this was a bit difficult. If I had known before, I would have arranged the gathers before shirring, then sewed the 2 pieces together. So then I cut off the excess fabric. Then I pinned and sewed down the other side seam. So to hem the bottom of the skirt, first I put the dress on and I marked where the middle of my knee was, where I wanted it to end, and then added a few centimeters seam allowance. Then I folded the fabric over twice, not bothering to pin anything, just first I folded it over to 0.5 centimeter and sewed it with the longest straight stitch.
Oh, that killed my needle. Yay. Why are you so fragile?
Then folded that over another 0.5 centimeter and sewed with a regular straight stitch. Now moving on to the sleeves. Well, that wasn't fake excitement. I will present all the steps on one sleeve because I did exactly the same for the other one. Okay, actually I didn't. I failed on one, so just look at this one. First off, I made a giant pattern. I cut out a pattern paper at least as long as the fabric I had left and folded it in half. I then took a blouse with reasonably large sleeves and traced around it, starting off by drawing dots. I had to make it a lot larger and longer, but I just wanted reference for the general shape. So then I took the piece of fabric I had left and folded it in half in order to cut out 2 sleeves at once. So I pinned the pattern onto the fabric, and since I was worried the pattern wasn't actually big enough to make the poofs that Chaeyoung's dress have, and I had so much extra fabric, I just added a few centimeters outside the pattern. This is where I would really love a huge ruler instead of 2 tiny ones. So then I cut the 2 sleeves out with my pizza slicer. So the giant sleeve is gathered in 3 places, and I started off at the top by the shoulder, moving down to above the elbow to the wrist. The gathering is created by the elastic that was in the bedsheet. So for the top of the shoulder, I first folded in half a centimeter off the very top and sewed with a long stitch length. Then to make a channel for the elastic, I measured the elastic. It was exactly 1 centimeter. So I folded in 1 centimeter plus about half a centimeter or less seam allowance. I pinned this down and sewed, making it as even and round as possible. Then I attached a safety pin to one end of the elastic and tugged this through the channel. Then it looked all cute and puffy, but in order to decide how gathered, that is how long the elastic needed to be, I tried it on. First I pinned the sleeve together at the top. Then I tugged on it to gather it more until it sat on securely and felt comfortable, not falling off, not stopping any blood circulation. When I was happy with it, I just put a pin at each end of the channel to make sure the elastic stayed in place. Then I cut them off, but I cut them off with a couple of extra centimeters just in case it would turn out too tight later on. Then to secure the elastic in place, I made 2 zigzag stitches on each end where the channel began. Then I tried it on again, and as it was comfortable, I cut the extra elastic off. Moving on to the second gathering, I made another type of channel. I could have just sewed the elastic to the inside, but 1, I don't think it's very comfortable against the skin. 2, the fabric was see-through and it wouldn't look very neat if you saw the elastic, in my opinion. So in order to decide where I wanted this channel, I put a hair tie above my elbow, exactly where it looked like the gathering was on Chaeyoung's dress. Then I traced around this above and below very roughly. Then I took the sleeve off, and indeed there were marks all over the place, but I found the most unanimous height and drew a straight line from that one along the entire width of the sleeve. Then I put my other sleeve on top of this one and copied the line. I could have just measured, but I couldn't find the tape measure at the time and I was a bit late. I don't have to explain myself, it worked out fine. Okay, so it was 1 centimeter off. Then using a scrap piece of the same fabric that was appreciatively longer or wider enough as the sleeve was wide, I need 1 centimeter for the elastic, but I also added 1 centimeter seam allowance on each side of this channel, so I marked 3 centimeters on the scrap piece, made a little snip, then ripped out a skinny spaghetti of the fabric. Then I ironed in the 2 seam allowances. Then don't focus too much on the left hand side here, where the spaghetti is not as long or longer than the sleeves, because I realized after filming this that it needed to be as long or longer on each end. So then I pinned that onto the wrong side of the sleeve, putting the pins on the right side. First I sewed down the top of the channel with a regular straight stitch, then the bottom. This time I tried the elastic on around my arm where I wanted it and cut it off so it sat tight but comfortably with seam allowance. Then I just repeated the safety pin through elastic, elastic through channel, try on, pin when happy, step from earlier. Then I folded the sleeve in half, right sides together, and sewed it close. I made sure to pin and sew so that the 2 ends of the channel met perfectly with the 2 stitches that I sewed over the elastic so that it stayed in place. Now for the last gathering by the wrist, I made the same type of channel that I did for the shoulder. Fold in twice, make room for the elastic, sew with a straight stitch. This time though, I left an opening in order to get the elastic through, then once again feeding the elastic through, fitting to my liking. Then I sewed the two ends of the elastic together, making 2 sturdy zigzag stitches. After this, I sewed the opening closed, avoiding to sew into the elastic. And finally, it was time to complete the dress by attaching the 2 sleeves. This is very simple when you have 2, well, sorta, rectangle bodice pieces. I just pinned the right sides of the sleeves, starting by matching up the seam of the sleeve onto the side seam onto the right side of the dress. The part with the zigzag stitch, aka where the elastic begins and ends, I pinned just before the beginning and end of the top of the dress. That is, I sewed it down right so that you couldn't see the zigzag stitch. This was because the zigzag stitch wasn't very pretty, and this way all you can see is the gathering of the sleeve. After sewing both sleeves in place far away from the armpit, and I think we all know why, I cut off the excess fabric of the top, and now I had an armhole that didn't go to Sweat City. And there we got Chaeyoung's dress in bedsheet, and here's the grand reveal. And lost my voice. Okay, here we go.